Hey there viewers, my name is Brad. I'm a Harley Davidson dealer technician and we're going to be working on a 2019 Screamin' Eagle Street Glide. We're going to be installing a Vance Hines exhaust system while keeping the OEM Screamin' Eagle slip-on mufflers. We're going to be working on this pole hoist. That's an in-ground pole hoist that's mounted in my bay for the majority of the video. You want to make sure that your motorcycle's safely situated however you're going to be working on it. We might as well start out by getting the saddlebags out of the way. They're easy to get damaged and super expensive to replace, so you want to be careful with them. Pop them off and put them somewhere safe. The first step is using a 5/16 socket or Allen wrench or whatever you have to take off the rider footboard. You always want to be conscious of all of the expensive parts on the motorcycle. Personally, I always put a fender cover on a motorcycle. It doesn't matter whether I'm working on the front end or the back end. It makes sense and it's smart. Always use protection. Now we're going to be removing the front and rear cylinder heat shields so that we can gain access to the exhaust nuts. That's a 5/16 1/4" socket. Makes it pretty easy. I use a little Milwaukee 1/4" ratchet.
What? Right here? Yep, right there is perfect.
Those are my co-workers. They don't know that I'm making a video. It's hard for them to see a big camera sitting around. So they just come by talking to me anytime. I'm going to be using a little 5/16, just an open-ended wrench here on this lowest worm drive clamp. Just because of the way that it's sitting on the hoist, it's hard to initially reach it with a socket. So I'm just going to sit here and struggle with it for a second. Now that we finally have that clamp moved around a little bit, taking a short break, we're going to finally get that front heat shield off. We're going to exercise some caution here and add a couple layers of protection. The rear brake lever on this model is powder coated gloss black. Powder coating is soft and it can chip or mar or scratch very easily. I like to use 3 layers of green tape. 1 layer is probably just fine. Just 3 layers makes me feel good. So I put a little on the rear brake lever and also on the lower frame down tube that's just in front of the front exhaust pipe, because once you're moving the exhaust system, the exhaust flange is going to come down there and it could potentially get lodged between the cylinder head and that down tube. You might as well just not nick the frame. Keep it nice. The front oxygen sensor is zip tied to the oil pressure switch, so I'm just reaching in there with a pair of diagonal cutters, separating that zip tie. It's a real small space in there. It would have been nice if they would have made it a little more convenient, but they didn't. We're going back in there with another pair of diagonal cutters, and we're going to get it this time. Easy peasy. Next step is to get that beautiful side cover out of the way. Then we have access to the oxygen sensor connectors. We're going to unplug those and unroute them through the frame. They slide forward through the frame, and then the front oxygen sensor has a couple zip ties on it as it runs down along the lower frame tube, and it tucks in behind the hydraulic clutch line, so you gotta untuck it from there. Make sure that you stay properly hydrated. Diet Mountain Dew. Doesn't taste like regular Mountain Dew, but it's not bad. Since we're going to be reusing these slip-on mufflers in our new installation of the Vance Hines header pipe, that's 9/16 deep well socket. It works on the left side muffler clamp. The right side is a different size. It's a 15mm that's on the right side. Loosen them up. And then the torque clamps are kind of funny. Once you get the nut loosened up, you wiggle it back and forth, and then it'll break loose. Use a little WD-40. It'll slide right in there. Make it easy to get the pipes on and off. That's a 1/2 inch deep well socket I just grabbed. Slipped my mind to show it. But we're using that to loosen up the rear muffler bolts where it goes through the rubber isolator on the saddlebag support frame. Now that we already have loosened up the front clamps and lubed them up, pop off the rear 2 screws and wiggle and slide. Put them somewhere safe. when you start wiggling the muffler, you want to be aware that you don't wiggle it upwards and scratch it into the bottom of the muffler bracket. I like to do like a half moon type of shape, right and left and down. And when you're doing that, it'll draw in the WD-40 that you just squirted there. It just takes a little spritz, but when you're working it back and forth like that, makes it easy. Next, we're going to remove the left exhaust pipe crossover. That's the short extension I have on a 1/2 inch socket. On this particular hoist, it gives you very little room to work in there, in front of the rear tire that is. So this setup gets me in there just enough to pull the nut out, pull the bolt out, remove the clamp. And if we were planning ahead, we're going to use a 15mm socket to loosen up the clamp on that left side crossover. That's a 1/2 inch wobble socket I have. When you buy wobble sockets, you want to buy good quality ones, not the cheap ones that have the pins that fall out that you get from typical auto parts stores. That's a snap-on one. I've used it forever, and it's really nice because when you put it hang it in a certain angle, you can lean it into a hole or wherever you need to, and it stays in that direction. It makes it really easy to get on and off nuts or bolts. I didn't show it very well because my body was in the way, but the exhaust system is held to the engine with just one clamp. That's basically like right in the middle of the front and rear exhaust pipe on the lower end there. That takes the same 1/2 inch socket that the top exhaust nuts are. So you basically end up with 5 exhaust nuts. The exhaust system is free to come off now. You want to start off with the rear exhaust pipe. Reach up there with your index finger or whatever, and your middle finger, and wiggle that rear flange loose till it falls down like you just saw, and then do the same with the front. Here we see the box with a part number on it for the black Vance Hines Power Duals that we're going to be using. You want to have a nice spot to pull everything out and lay it down. That's like working up waist height, because working on the floor is no fun. Here we're going to be using a 18mm by 1.5 tap to clean out the threads for the 18mm O2 sensor bungs. I do this on every single exhaust system I get, and it kills me when other customers don't do this and they bring me motorcycles to tune. You have to remember that this exhaust pipe was just a piece of steel that was made, and then it was coated in whatever it was coated in, whether it's powder coated or ceramic coated or chrome plated. All of that stuff builds up in the threads. In a later video, we're going to be dyno tuning this motorcycle. We're going to be using the Power Vision, and we put wideband O2 sensors into those O2 sensor holes. And when those threads are clogged up, it makes it a real pain in the butt. I like to pull it out of the package and do it all while it's zip tied and everything's covered in foam. This way, there is essentially zero chance of scratching or damaging anything. So much better than trying to lay it on the ground and work with it while you're holding it with your feet or your legs or your teeth or whatever. Find the most expensive pair of diagonal cutters that you have to cut these plastic little zip ties. Show it who's boss. Those are dog ring pliers. They're kind of like needle nose pliers, but flipped inside out so that the outsides are flat, and they have a small dimple in the center to hold the C-clamp that holds on the exhaust flange. They're called dog ring pliers. So you slide the exhaust flange over the exhaust pipe, and then you retain it with the retaining ring. It's a pretty stout retaining ring, but you want to put the retaining ring on there and then pull the flange back up and then make sure that the ring seats fully into the flange and that it isn't bent or tweaked or hanging out, or it's going to give you problems. Before we go and get overly excited about putting the exhaust system on, you want to take a moment and make sure that you've done everything that you needed to make your life easy. And I forgot. That's a 5.5mm socket. And there's a stud that originally held on the exhaust mounting bracket. And this new exhaust system, it shows you in the instructions, but also at this exact moment, I remembered that the Vance Hines isn't going to use that stud. It comes with a bolt, so you got to pull that stud out. And it's easier now than it is when you have the exhaust system hanging in your hands. And also, now that we have the exhaust system removed, it's easier to get at that stinking oil pressure switch, O2 sensor, zip tie holder, and then plug the oil pressure sensor switch back in so that you don't have to weasel back in there behind the pipe. I'm visually showing you to inspect your exhaust gaskets to make sure that they're in good condition. I only ever reuse exhaust gaskets on a brand new motorcycle. Any other time it's not worth it, but on a brand new motorcycle, they're also still brand new. They really don't take a compression or a fit. But you don't want to run your hands around in there as you saw me. I was just doing it as a visual cue. The exhaust gaskets are made out of like a woven wire mesh, and they'll definitely stick in your finger. You want to start with installing the exhaust system in the front head pipe first. You want to get the flange pretty close. I like to get it basically in the hole, and then just have a nut thread on there by a thread or two, and then you'll pull the rear pipe out away from the engine, and then the pipe will slide into the exhaust gasket and it'll support itself, and then you can go back around, put the rest of the exhaust nuts on. Only hand tight, as installing the rest of the exhaust system and inlining it is a very important step. If you drop or lose any nuts or bolts, it's super important that you find them. I can't tell you how many times I've found battery bolts or air deflector, heat air deflector bolts wedged in between primaries and frames and transmission cases and subframes that cause all sorts of vibration problems. And it's really easy. You know when you lost something, you just go back and find it. And we still have the exhaust nuts very loose at this point. I haven't used a ratchet on the extension or anything. The next step is going to be installing the original exhaust mount that we removed from the OEM exhaust system. It's a two-piece clamp. 1.5 slides over the exhaust pipe, and you see you just kind of wing it in there. And we're supplied with a new bolt and washer and spacer with the Vance Hines exhaust system. It comes with a lock washer. I don't put the lock washer on there, but it's wise to put blue Loctite on this bolt, just like that, a little dab. And then you'll slide the bolt and the washer through the clamp, then through the spacer, and then it threads into the engine case. And again, we leave the clamp loose. This is kind of like the first stage of tightening the exhaust system up. Now we're tightening it up just a little bit, so if we have to work the pipe with the slip-on, because sometimes the slip-on muffler hole is slightly smaller than like the outside diameter of the exhaust pipe. There are certain tools to enlarge the slip-on muffler, but you know what I mean, the pipe's got to slide over the other one. So we need the exhaust system to be just tight enough where it's not loose and we aren't fighting it and it's banging around and clanking other components on the motorcycle. So I'll run the nuts in just till they're slightly taut, and then I typically back them out maybe just a turn so that everything's seated but nothing is tight. Now we're going to put the slip-on muffler on. Experience has shown me that where you want the slip-on muffler typically to fit within the rear rubber mount is about halfway. There are certain variables that will change that. Now with the fitting of the exhaust system, you want to err on the side of caution. So if you're unsure of where the muffler is potentially going to fit, leave it the most rearward, and then once you start fitting the heat shields, you can always bring the slip-on muffler in. But you don't want to have the slip-on muffler too far in and then gouge it with a heat shield, because then you're screwed. So you torque down the rear muffler nuts, factory spec of course. And now that we have the exhaust components together, now we can start tightening down the exhaust system. It's important that we did it this way because the engine is rubber mounted. So the engine moves up and down. So the exhaust system moves up and down. And the rear slip-on muffler isolator is not made to move sideways at all. It's actually made so that the muffler can move slightly forward and backward in the rubber mount. Because as you're accelerating, the engine pitches backwards, so the exhaust system actually moves back slightly. And as you decelerate in gear, like if you're coming up to a stoplight and you're decelerating, the engine pitches forward. So the exhaust system actually slides forward slightly. That's where I put a lot of emphasis on getting everything lined up right. It's so tight up front there with these new Milwaukee 8s. We dropped a nut again, and we're gonna get it. We're gonna be persistent, and we're gonna get it. Don't ever leave any loose nuts or bolts. You want to draw the exhaust nuts in evenly. Basically so you have the same amount of threads showing on each exhaust stud. That's what I was doing by hand. And then I'm going in and I'm doing the same thing. I'm going back and forth from exhaust stud to exhaust stud with the torque wrench and bringing them up to torque. It's important that you do it this way because if you remember how the exhaust clamps were, if you overload one side of the exhaust clamp ring, it can pop off and your exhaust system won't be secured and sealed the way that it needs to be. So bring your exhaust nuts in evenly, torque them factory spec of course. And another customer comes through. Didn't see the big camera.
Forgot to ask if that sleeve still on there. Sure.
Even though I work in the very corner of a basement below a 2-story building, people know how to come and find you. Here are the DynoJet wideband O2 sensors we're going to be installing. That's one O2 sensor tool I've modified and a wrench I've cut in half and modified, because Vance Hines has the dumbest way of setting up O2 sensor bones. They make it very hard and inconvenient to get to. They used to not be that way. They used to have normal O2 sensor bungs. There's a couple things about this exhaust system that make it not a good choice. One's the O2 sensor bungs, and in another episode you're going to see the heat shields. The heat shields also make it a bad choice, but let's continue on with install. That's a little 1/4 inch ratcheting wrench with a 3/16 bit in it that I'm using to remove the 2 bolts that hold the factory exhaust bracket into the back of the transmission housing. Again, the quarters are so tight here with this type of hoist. But now we have the new assembled component that Vance Hines offers. Everything's loose, of course. We're using the stock hardware with a little drip of blue Loctite on each. We're gonna thread these in just enough where they seat, and then again back them out about a turn, because now that we need to set up the alignment on the left hand side of this exhaust system. Here we install the torque clamp that's supplied by Vance Hines. You'll want to install it so that the bolt and the nut are facing the transmission, so that when you go install the heat shield you have room, because if the clamp is facing the rear of the vehicle you will not have room. Grab the muffler. We toss her on. You can see how everything is still so loose right there. It's important because ultimately you want to line this slip-on muffler up so that it's parallel with the saddlebag support rail, because you can line it up so it's crazy crooked. But now that we have extended saddlebags on a lot of vehicles, if it's crazy crooked, it could rub the saddlebag. And really what we're aiming for here is a nice even fit, basically, so that the slip-ons look good with both saddlebags, that the gaps are even, that the mufflers are even with each other, you know, one isn't further in or further out. Quality. We're looking for quality here. Torque it down, factory spec. There's the ruler. Use the ruler. Now I'm making the assumption that I'm not going to have to move the slip-ons after I tighten the front clamp down. The only reason I would need to move them is for how the heat shields ultimately stack up. Because if the heat shields stack up and there isn't enough room, then you have to move the mufflers backwards. I've done this a few times. Not very many times with Scream and Eagle mufflers, but I've got a pretty good idea, and I'm going with it. I'm starting to tighten down the Torque clamp that I put on previously from down below, because that's going to raise up the front of the slip-on muffler. Because when everything's relaxed, it's hanging by its own weight. But once we start to tighten that muffler up, or tighten that clamp up, it's going to bring the muffler up, and we'll start to tighten everything down, essentially starting from here. I'm pointing out, you don't really have to put your hand up there and look like you're running down a runway. It was just a visual cue to put the emphasis in making sure your muffler is parallel with the saddlebag guard, or the saddlebag support, so that everything's going to be looking right. Here I grab a 1/2 inch socket to tighten up the carriage bolt that came with the Vance Hines kit. And I realize that it's not a 1/2 inch. That's what the OEM size nut is. But that it's a 9/16. So I'm going to go get it. Now that we've tightened up the carriage bolt, we still have those 2 screws that are on the back of the transmission bracket that are loose, and we're going to tighten those up. Those are the 3/16 Allen bit that I have in a little 1/4 inch ratcheting guy, and we're going to tighten those up. Before we tighten the clamp down, we want to make sure that the slip-on muffler is level. Because if it's not level, it's going to look stupid. Level it out. Put just enough torque on the clamp, really kind of that it holds its spot. And torquing to factory spec. While installing the exhaust system, I noticed that the factory battery tender lead is essentially sitting on the exhaust system, which is kind of the way that it comes. So if you're cool, you pull the battery tender lead up and then outside of the side cover so that you can actually reach it while the vehicle's on its side stand. So here I'm rerouting the battery tender lead. And I also have the data link connector lead sticking up out of the side cover at this time too. When the bike's finished, I'm going to tuck that part back in, leaving only the battery tender lead up by the grab strap. Now the bike's basically finished, and this is in the condition that I take it down to the dyno at. We have a dyno that's in a different building, just basically the next street down the road. But especially on your chrome shiny parts, you want to use Windex to clean any fingerprints off. There's no reason to burn a bunch of fresh fingerprints into your new pipe. So here you're going to see I'm going to use a Windex to make sure that there isn't any type of crap on the exhaust system. And then on black surfaces, I go back along with a type of brake cleaner that we have. It's not like brake cleaner that you buy at the auto parts store. So don't go get any non-chlorinated brake parts cleaner and spray it on your exhaust system. It's probably a bad idea. This is a special type of solvent. It's much more almost like a rubbing alcohol, but it removes any type of oil or fingerprints from black surfaces. And since we won't need to be on this side of the vehicle anymore, we might as well put this heat shield on. If you're cool, you have your heat shield worm drive clamps so that the heads are facing down, so that when the vehicle is on its side stand, you can't visually see them. And she's a tight fit. Thanks for watching this video. This is one of a 3-part series. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Give us a thumbs up. The next 2 videos are going to be the final heat shield assembly and also this vehicle on the dyno. Thanks. See you next time. And here's the brake cleaner that I was talking about. It's made by Worth. You can probably buy it in a 2 or 5 gallon pail, but it removes any type of impurities in a black finish very well.